I think we're in a very interesting situation in which the landscape of the Middle East is being reshaped in front of our eyes.
We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
President Zelensky has for the first time acknowledged that his forces are conducting a cross-border offensive inside Russia.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
This is an emergency episode of Battle Lines. We're coming to you on Monday, September 30th. On Friday, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, was assassinated by Israel in an airstrike in southern Beirut. I'm joined by Roland Oliphant, our senior foreign correspondent, here in the studio in London, Adrian Blomfield in Lebanon, and Paul Nuki in Israel. Roland, I want to start with you. Can you bring us up to date about what's been happening over the last few days?
Yes, Hassan Nasrallah, the very long-serving chief of Hezbollah, was killed in an Israeli airstrike on Friday. And since then, over the weekend, things have just escalated, really. So Monday morning, the Israelis have conducted another airstrike, this time on central Beirut. We think it's the first time they've hit central Beirut. They've hit the south before. It seems to have hit an apartment building in the Kola Bridge area, predominantly Sunni. Adrian will correct me on that if I'm wrong. Seems to have targeted the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and killed 3 leaders, we think. The Lebanese Health Ministry says at least 105 people were killed around the country in Israeli airstrikes on Sunday. They hit the south. They also hit the central, eastern, and western Bekaa Valley. On the Israeli side, yesterday on Sunday, we had reports that Israeli commandos have crossed the border into Lebanon. We were told by the IDF that the special forces are targeting Hezbollah infrastructure in an effort to push them back from the border. But we've also seen tanks massing in northern Israel in obvious possible preparation for a larger ground war. The IDF, the Israelis will not confirm or deny if they're going to cross the border in force, but that's obviously one step up the escalation ladder from where we are now. Meanwhile, the Israelis also have hit Yemen. That's only the second time the Israelis have done airstrikes on Yemen against the Houthis. The first strike was in July in response to a Houthi drone attack on Tel Aviv. This is a much bigger strike. The Houthis say it killed at least 4 people. They struck the port city of and also the port of Ras Issa, along with 2 power plants. That is from the Houthis. This comes a day after the Houthis launched a missile attack on Israel's Ben Gurion airport. Significance, well, the Houthis are very much part of this so-called axis of resistance, kind of coordinated from Iran, along with Hezbollah, along with Hamas. So next big question, what is Iran saying? Well, Iran has said this morning, the Iranian Foreign Ministry, that any criminal act, that's the quote, of Israel will not go unanswered. That was a reference to the killing of both Hassan Nasrallah, but also an Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps deputy commander who was in the same building and killed in the same airstrike. His name was Brigadier General Abbas. Now, that comes on Sunday. That comment follows Iran's president's comments on Sunday. Pezeshkian, the newly elected Iranian president, said that there would be a decisive response. The Lebanese fighters should not be left alone in this battle. But Iran has yet to say what it is going to do in response to this. A Western response, well, Joe Biden said yesterday that he is going to speak to Benjamin Netanyahu. When he was asked if an all-out war in the Middle East should be avoided, he replied, it has to be. European Union foreign ministers will hold an emergency crisis meeting via video conference on Monday afternoon. The sense is definitely that we are closer to that this bogeyman, if I can put it that way, of the all-out regional war, but maybe we're already in it. I don't know. That's where we are this morning.
Lots to unpack there, and we'll get into all of that. Adrian, I just want to start with you. Give us a sense of the mood in Lebanon now and the reaction to Nasrallah's death, because he was a divisive figure, but he was perhaps misunderstood. He spoke to the Lebanese public every week in addresses that were quite personal. He would make jokes. He was certainly a sort of bogeyman, sorry to Roland, steal your word, of the wider Middle East and for Israel, but he had sort of acquired mythological status. Hadn't been seen in public for ages. When Hezbollah would hold press conferences, you'd turn up and often he'd just be there on a screen. He was very careful. What's the reaction been to his death in Lebanon, and what will the significance of this be for Hezbollah?
Yes, as you say, he was a colossal figure. Love him or loathe him, one of the most recognizable figures in the Middle East. And that's why I think there was shock across the sectarian spectrum I was just off Martyrs Square, actually speaking to an analyst on the phone when the news broke on Saturday. In the morning, the Israel Defense Forces had said that he had been killed, but people here refused to believe it. They thought it was Israeli propaganda. And I think there was just genuinely a belief that Nasrallah could not die. He could not be killed by Israel. He was protected by God. He was their great champion. And of course, that wasn't just a champion of the resistance against Israel. He was also the champion of the downtrodden Shia. He had given them a political voice. He had provided services. He had raised Shia pride among a marginalized community. And I was on the phone, and suddenly there was a woman next to me who just started wailing. And I thought that she had just received news that a member of her family had been killed. But then I looked around, and there were more people. It was a ripple of grief that just went in waves through all of these people who had just been displaced, that fled overnight from that massive bomb that killed Nasrallah, that caused terror. I mean, immediately afterwards, it was so loud it echoed across Beirut. Immediately afterwards, thousands of people were on their feet walking out of Dahiyeh, the strongholds of South Beirut. And although they had lost their homes, they took this blow even harder. And women were inconsolable for hours. And immediately afterwards, you heard Shia men in various parts of the city firing their guns in the air in a combination of grief and anger. And that caused a sense of panic in the rest of the city. Immediately, shops started to close. People went home because this is a very fragile society and people don't know what happens next. You head away from Martyrs Square into eastern Beirut and you speak to Christians, and there was a completely different mood. There was little sign of celebrations. We saw celebrations in Syria, and maybe we'll talk about Syria later, and possibly one or two celebrations in Christian areas to the north of Beirut. But here there was a sense of quiet satisfaction. There's anger with Israel in all parts of Lebanese society, don't get me wrong. But people I was speaking to saw the death of Nasrallah, in their words, as a step in the right direction, because they believed that he was the big stumbling block to the normalization of Lebanese society.
And what militarily and politically as well, because Hezbollah obviously has a political branch and a social welfare branch as well as its military branch, what does the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, and indeed almost the entire top echelon of its leadership over the last 2 weeks, what does that mean for the organisation going forward?
Well, that's a very big question, because the killing of Nasrallah was obviously the latest and biggest blow in a campaign that has been conducted by Israel with metronomic precision. We saw the attacks first that wiped out or devastated the communications network and put out of action perhaps 1,500 mid-ranking experienced fighters who would have led battlefield operations with the pager and walkie-talkie attacks. And then this series, which had preceded the pager attacks, but then escalated afterwards, of decapitation strikes aimed at killing the top military leaders. And if you look at the Jihad Council, the military wing or the military leadership of Hezbollah, 8 out of 9 of those on that council have been killed. So this is an organization that has been extremely hollowed out. And I think the new leader of Hezbollah is in a completely different position to Hassan Nasrallah. For a start, Hassan Nasrallah had 32 years in which to build up this force with obviously Iranian backing to become this huge figure. Whoever replaces him does not have that level of stature, first of all, and he's taking over an organization that has been completely hollowed out. So militarily, obviously, there is turmoil. I wouldn't go so far as to say that Hezbollah is finished. And I think, if there is a ground, you could potentially still see the advantage swing away. So, for Israel, that's a very dangerous step to potentially take. It would be another gamble, but you would be fighting Hezbollah on home turf in an area after all of those years of experience that Hezbollah has had fighting in Syria, where Hezbollah would feel more comfortable because that technological edge that Israel has may be slightly negated. At the same time, that's the military side. At the same time, if we look at the political side, there are going to be those in Lebanon from other communities the Sunni Muslims, the Christians, the Druze, who have deeply resented, in many cases, the influence that Hezbollah has had in Lebanese society over the years, and blame them for a series of things. So where I am, where my hotel is, for example, in Jamaizi, was devastated by the Beirut port blast in 2020. And the buildings are still a total wreck. People are still trying to rebuild them, but because of the financial crisis, people can't afford to. Lebanon is a country that has been laid low by a series of blows that often have got nothing to do with this conflict. But people blame Hezbollah for that. So it's a very corrupt society, and Hezbollah was seen as controlling the port and therefore allowing this disaster to happen because law and order and rules had broken down. And then Hezbollah was seen as stymieing the investigation into the port. And that led to serious trouble in 2021. There was violent protests in the city on a sectarian level in which suspected Christian gunmen engaged Hezbollah and its allies on the streets. And that's the kind of thing that people are worried about, which is why the Lebanese army has taken up positions on bridges separating predominantly Christian districts from Shia ones.
Paul, I want to bring you in here because I imagine the mood in Israel is very different today. This is an operation that has clearly been underway for nearly 2 decades since the humiliation that Israel felt it suffered after the 2006 war against Hezbollah. What is the mood in Israel right now? How are people receiving the news of Nasrallah's death?
Well, I mean, it's split, obviously, but in Jewish Israel, people are buoyant. There's no doubt at all. And I've been coming here, since October 7, when things could not have been lower. And it's the first time that there's a real buoyancy back on the street. No doubt about it. It's been building for Netanyahu ever since he started these assassinations in April with the strike on the Iranian embassy in Damascus, killing an Iranian general. And slowly his poll ratings have been climbing since then with each new strike that he takes to the enemy. And this, of course, the killing of Nasrallah is the top of the poll. People are absolutely delighted. They feel that the Israeli military, humiliated last year in October 7, is now on a roll again. How long it will last is unclear. I mean, there's a feeling of elation, a feeling of relief, but things change very quickly here. A week today, we will be commemorating October 7, and that is something that, in many ways, Bibi would rather avoid. That's the event that he doesn't want to be reminded of. There are still 100 or more hostages being held in Gaza. They've been there for a year. So Jewish society will focus on that in the coming days, and it may dampen spirits again. In Palestinian Israeli society, there's a sadness about Nasrallah being killed. One Christian Palestinian woman, she told me that he gave us hope, even though he never delivered on it. And that's a pretty typical Palestinian view, a bit of sadness dashed with humor. They look at all their leaders with a bit of humor. Mohammed Abbas, leader of the Palestinian Authority, he is referred to by this woman anyway as the gift that God gave us that he is not planning to take back. So that's the way that Palestinian Israelis are seeing it.
What do you think are the chances of an Israeli ground invasion of southern Lebanon? We heard, obviously, when the pager explosions went off, that there were briefings from the US. It was a use it or lose it situation, that it had been intended as a preparation for an invasion, but now that's not really what was going on here. That now looks very different in hindsight. And as Roland said, we've seen reports of special forces going in, lots of tanks massing on the border, reservists called up. What are you hearing in Israel?
Yes, I mean, Adrian and I were talking about this yesterday. It does rather look as if the use it to lose it excuse was just that in retrospect. It looks like this was something planned. And if that is right, I would expect a ground incursion of some sort. Militarily, Israel is aiming to return its citizens to the north. And it's quite hard to see how it will do that without physically securing southern Lebanon, because you only need to fire a shoulder-held grenade once a week, really, into these communities to make sure that they don't come back. And unless you've got troops on the ground really clearing the area, it's hard to see how that will happen. And as Adrian says, it's a dangerous moment because although Hezbollah has been massively degraded as a conventional military force, it started life as a guerrilla organization, and that's where its expertise is. And it's been fighting that war in Syria recently. So its people are well trained, and to some extent, I'm afraid, will be itching for a fight. And I think that poses another question for Israel. This escalation has been designed, they talk about escalate to de-escalate. But so far, we're not seeing a de-escalation. The rockets and missiles keep coming. It means that Israel is sort of stuck on an escalatory ladder. And that could yet, I think, lead to direct strikes on Iran and a much, much bigger conflict. Roland asked earlier, are we in a regional war? Well, there is a regional war of sorts going, but, it is a regional war that could yet become much, much bigger if Iran and Israel go to head, which would inevitably drag in the Americans. And then we're looking at something on the scale of Iraq 20 years ago.
Adrian, I just want to ask you about this buffer zone that Israel is talking about, it wanting to implement. It's saying it wants to push Hezbollah north of the Litani River, which is a river in Lebanon. This is a zone that they've occupied before. When they invaded in 1982, they ended up staying in this southern zone, kind of through a proxy army called the South Lebanon Army, until 2000. They tried again in 2006. They didn't fail. What are their chances of creating a buffer zone? And also, I'd love to hear your opinion on whether Hezbollah really is keeping missiles in everyone's attics, like Israel claims.
I think that last question is quite difficult. I think from some of the explosions that we have seen, the secondary detonations would suggest that some of the targets that have been hit in residential areas may contain explosives, but I think it's not something that I would make a call on. Of course, that area of southern Lebanon, south of the Litani River, is also, there are a great number of tunnels that will be harder to target than in Gaza, which are mainly under sand, because these are built into mountains. And some of them are as deep as 85 yards under the ground. And Hezbollah were the ones who taught Hamas to make tunnels. So, any conflict in southern Lebanon, as we've been saying, is something that a lot of Hezbollah's fighters will be itching for, and potentially a new leadership. Hassan Nasrallah's cousin, who's the favorite to take over, is seen as a little bit more radical. Nasrallah was a master of geopolitics, and he sort of understood when to push and when not to, although obviously there have been serious miscalculations in the past year, but he was seen as being more geopolitically astute in terms of understanding the situation, which Safieddin or whoever takes over might not be. I mean, I would say that the one thing that we should bear in mind is that we heard that the consensus was that any conflict with Hezbollah would have Israel on the back foot, and that's not been the case so far. So the expert view has generally been wrong on this, because Israel, while it engaged in intelligence neglect of the situation in Gaza, believing this, in the narrative of it being a situation of stable instability, it has focused on southern Lebanon, on Hezbollah for the last 19 years. In its planning, it would be looking at what are the lessons to be learned from the failures of 2006, both in terms of the airstrikes, the missile strikes, but also in terms of the land invasion. So I think we need to be a little bit careful in saying that, this is a huge gamble. But it still is a huge gamble, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Israel will come off the worst from it. But from Hezbollah's perspective, they certainly will be relishing the opportunity to confront Israel on what they will see as a more level playing field. Now, of course, under UN Resolution 1701 that ended the 2006, that 34-day conflict in which Israeli troops came into southern Lebanon, and it ended up as that sort of stalemate, which was presented in Lebanon by Nasrallah as a victory. Under 1701, Hezbollah was supposed to disarm and move all of its forces north of the Litani River. That has not happened.
How did the Israelis achieve this? Do we know anything specifically about? We've talked a little bit about it, but how on earth they've managed to incredibly best Hezbollah in a way? I mean, how on earth did they get inside the organization in that way? The other question is, a really nagging question is that for
Yes,
years we've been told
I think
by
I've lost
regional
internet
analysts,
connection. Do you want me to pick
by
that up?
Israeli
or
officials, by the IDF, whoever, that look, Lebanon's got this enormous stockpile of 150,000, 110,000, 200,000 rockets, and all they have to do is fire them and it will overwhelm the Iron Dome and Israel will basically be wiped out, or it will be very difficult. And that just hasn't happened. Why not?
The answer is twofold, or threefold perhaps. First, Israel's been planning an assault on Hezbollah for a good long time, 10 years or more. Secondly, it adjusted its approach at least 10 years ago. It used to view Hezbollah as a simple terrorist organization. It started to take it much more seriously and applied much better and much more sophisticated intelligence against it. So there's been, over the last decade, a huge effort to understand exactly who belongs to Hezbollah, where they sit within Hezbollah, where they hang out, how they communicate. There's clearly been a lot of work on supply lines with the pages and the rest of it. So Israel has been planning this assault, this multi-phase assault, for a long time. And that's why, once it's been released, starting with the pager attack, I think, and then these precision strikes on arms caches, leadership, etc., it's been able to move so rapidly and so fast. And as Adrian says, Israel will have considered the dangers of a ground offensive in southern Lebanon. But I think it is still true of every war. It's certainly been true in Gaza. The minute you start to move into a ground offensive, the harder it gets. People can pop up, they can ambush you, you're closer to the troops, and the damage starts to accumulate. And we mustn't forget, Israel has paid a huge cost over the last year in terms of troops and injuries and deaths. Absolutely enormous, quite apart from the economic cost. So it's not a cost-free thing, this, but it has been, miraculously and carefully planned in Lebanon.
Let's get into these fears of a wider regional war. Roland, you gave us some statements from Iran, but otherwise they've been fairly quiet over the last few days, haven't they? What do we think is going on in Tehran right now?
I think Iran are in a real bind because I'll hazard a guess that they weren't expecting this Israeli assault on Hezbollah to be quite so successful, or anything that's happened. I'll hazard a guess that wasn't some cunning 4D chess move that Tehran was expecting and has a plan for. And Hezbollah was, of course, in a way, their main kind of point of leverage in a much bigger kind of regional game plan. In a way, again, referring back to that, huge stockpile of weapons and so on, that was meant to be Tehran's kind of back pocket deterrent against Israel. It was meant to be the thing that stayed Israel's hand from striking Iran's nuclear program. So what do you do when you lose your deterrent? Well, maybe you rush for a bomb because you feel like you need a deterrent. Well, if you rush for a bomb now, your deterrent is suddenly off the table. What's to stop the Israelis from hitting your nuclear facilities and so on? So it's not a great moment. I mean, there's definitely analysis around there saying that, for Iran, they can see that Israel has the initiative at the moment, that it would be unwise to expand the war on Israel's terms at the moment, and maybe they're going to bide their time. But I think there's no doubt that the whole kind of credibility of the theory of the axis of resistance, as it has been called, is really taken a bitter blow over the past several weeks, but particularly over this weekend. But I think before we go further, I'd like to put this to Adrian and Paul and see if they can help us just paint the picture for listeners, because since October 7th, we've been talking about the danger of a regional war again and again. And when the Houthis began launching missiles at ships, we talked about the danger of a regional war. When the Iranians fired rockets at Israel, we talked about the danger of a regional war, but we're not there yet. What exactly is this regional war that everyone is afraid of spilling into? How would it be different from what's happening already? What are the worst case scenarios that we're talking about, and that the Americans, the West, Israel's allies are so, determined to avoid if they can?
I would characterize a full-scale regional war as one in which Israel, Iran, and the US are directly striking one another. That's the big risk. And a war like that would look much more like US and Allied invasion of Iraq and the bringing down of Saddam Hussein. And there is a sense in which Israel would like to see that war and would like to see Iran, its arch enemy, finished off for good, unable any longer to fund these proxies across the region. Certainly, there's a military argument for that. The other side of it, though, is the American side, the Western side, if you like. A war like that would do enormous damage to the global economy and would have enormous costs, just as Iraq did. And it could have enormous blowback, just as Iraq did with ISIS and the rest of it.
Paul, a few days ago, before you set off last time, we had a conversation where you seemed to be thinking that Nasrallah and Iran were pretty much sitting pretty, they were pretty pleased with where they'd got Israel. They felt like they could keep it tight. You seem to feel that Israel was really in a bit of a tight spot in the long term. Have you changed? Could you unpack that view for listeners? And could you tell us whether your views changed on that?
It's important to remember, too. I mean, Iran is very fragile. It's only last year that there were protests across the country over the treatment of women. Its water systems are unbelievably fragile, and the country's reliant on its water, obviously. Its economy is reliant on just a handful of ports, and Israel has clearly demonstrated what it can do to ports in Yemen if it wants to. So I think if an Israeli strike comes, those are going to be the initial targets. Essentially economic targets. Yes, perhaps also the nuclear bunkers, but I think those economic targets will be the thing because Israel knows that is the thing that could bring a fragile Iran to its knees politically.
Just to add to what Paul has said, is this is the reason why both Iran and Hezbollah didn't want to get drawn into the escalation and why they viewed it as a trap, because this kind of conflict, so we've seen Iran's strategy has not been working. So they relied on these proxies in the axis of resistance, as it called it, to on Israel, and that has failed. But in any kind of conflict of this nature, Israel, with its Western weaponry, retains that technological edge. And so I think that's why Iran is in this bind. It does feel fear an existential threat that it could be the end of the Islamic regime. And that's why they're in a bind, because they've got this choice between either escalating, coming to the support of its proxies. Remember, its proxies are supposed to be there to defend Iran, not Iran there to defend its proxies. But if it was in that situation and started firing at Israel, and then that gives a green light for Israel to launch a full-out offensive at Iran's nuclear capabilities, and then the Americans get drawn in, that's not a pretty picture from Tehran. Although, of course, there are divisions within the regime. So they're the moderates who are concerned about that, but there are people around the likes of Larijani, and we've seen it on state television, calling for retaliation. But that's the danger that the cooler heads are seeing in Iran, is that they just can't compete. They can fire rockets, but we've seen when they fired 300 rockets at Israel, Israel can defend itself. So it's a very difficult call to make. But if they do nothing, then you end up in this situation in which Iran is looking ever weaker. And so this is why people are making comparisons with the Six-Day War, because what the Six-Day War did, which started with a similar Operation Focus, that destroyed the Egyptian Air Force while it was on the ground, and then the Middle Eastern powers were defeated within 6 days. That's, for Israel, its greatest triumph. That resulted in Egypt being destroyed as the second axis of power in the Middle East and left Israel in charge. Iran has tried to take that place, which is why lots of Sunni states are so anxious about it. But Iran is now facing this moment when its ambitions to dominate the Middle East, to be the main rival of Israel in the Middle East, are seriously in question. So, whatever happens, I think we're in a very interesting situation in which the landscape of the Middle East is being reshaped in front of our eyes.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's Adrian Blomfield in Beirut, Paul Nuki in Tel Aviv, and Roland Oliphant here in the studio with me. We'll see you later this week for our usual Battle Lines episode. Thanks for joining us. That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.